We are so thankful you've chosen to spend some of your time with us to continue learning from the collective knowledge of our NYU community. Today's guest lecturer is Laura Edelson. Laura is a postdoctoral researcher in computer science at NYU Tandon School of Engineering. Laura, at this time, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Alexandra. Hey, folks, thanks for spending your lunch hour with us. Today, I'm going to be doing two things. First, I'm going to be walking you through, what the talk that was advertised, a discussion of defending against disinformation and some case studies of things we've seen go well and things we've seen go poorly. But I'm also going to show you today at Observatory a new product that we launched today. So with that, let's get going. Okay, can everyone see my screen? Can someone just give me a thumbs up? Okay, great, thanks. So, as you know, I'm a postdoc here at Tandon. And but I wanted to talk a little bit before we get too deep in the paint about disinformation. I want to talk a little bit about the perspective at which I and my team come at this set of problems. So first, I should say, I'm going to be talking today about misinformation through a cybersecurity lens. Really specifically, my research is about the way harmful content spreads through large online social networks. And, mis and disinformation is one of the types of harmful content I think, most people, could readily identify. But in all honesty, it's just not that different from the way fraud, like consumer fraud spreads. And there's a variety of harmful content. Something that's going to come up in our discussion today will be propaganda. So today we're going to be looking at a case study of masking disinformation during the COVID pandemic that was really prevalent in the United States in 2020. We're going to be talking about some Russian attempts at disinformation during the first weeks of their invasion of Ukraine. And then we're going to be talking a little bit about some of the lessons we can take away from these two examples. So first, let's look at some disinformation that started in earnest in say late March of 2020 about mask wearing. So before we introduce the disinformation, let's ground ourselves with the facts. So just so that everyone knows, both 3-layer surgical masks as well as N95 and the other variants of that type of mask, they are absolutely safe to wear all day. They are effective at lowering transmission of COVID-19. And something that you should note is these are really well-studied medical devices because they're used by medical professionals and have been for decades. But something that is easy to forget now when masks are everywhere and very easy to get is that in the early months of the pandemic, they were in extremely short supply. It was difficult to obtain a mask, and in many cases, you literally couldn't because health officials were restricting the sale of these masks. So with those facts in mind, let's consider this narrative that started spreading in early April of 2020. So people were spreading this false belief that face masks were dangerous to people's health. There was really a wide range of these supposed ill health effects that people suggested might come from wearing face masks. But the interesting thing about a lot of these narratives is that if you actually followed these posts all the way through to whatever they linked to, they were usually selling something. And what they were selling was very often some other type of mask. So let's again remember the background here. Surgical and N95 masks are very clearly safe. They have been in use by medical professionals for decades. Their safety profile was extensively studied. However, masks were really hard to come by. Cloth masks weren't as effective as disposable masks, but in the United States and indeed in most countries, we just did not have enough supply, even for frontline medical workers, let alone the general public. And this mask shortage led to a few things that combined to create a near perfect climate for misinformation about masks to spread. So first, the CDC misled the public about what they knew about the efficacy of masking. And then later, once misinformation was spreading, even beyond what the CDC had misled the public about, they really hesitated to say much about masks at all for fear of driving consumer demand of a product we had insufficient supply of. Additionally, commercial actors had incentives to spread misinformation about disposable masks as a means of marketing their own cloth masks or to command a premium for their supposedly safer masks. And people who couldn't get a hold of disposable masks or didn't like wearing masks for comfort reasons, they were motivated to find reasons why something that they couldn't or didn't want to use was dangerous anyway. So we have a situation where we have incentive on just about everyone's side to spread this misinformation and on the part of consumers to believe it. But this has some really serious consequences. Polling from late 2020 through to today indicates that 10% of Americans believe that masks are dangerous to their health. What I find really interesting about that statistic is this is actually this is consistently more than people who believe that masks aren't necessary, which I think goes to show that there is a certain amount of doublethink that people are very capable of doing. Okay, moving on to another little case study. So like the COVID pandemic, there were many strains of disinformation during the early stages of the Russian invasion, but we're going to zoom in on just one point. So again, let's just frame a few basic facts for ourselves. Donetsk and Luhansk are the Ukrainian regions with the largest proportion of Russian speakers. However, most Ukrainians nationwide are bilingual, and surveys of native Russian speakers inside Ukraine show that the vast majority of them think of themselves as Ukrainian. And the distinction I'm making here is, again, most people inside Russia who speak Russian as a first language, they don't think of themselves as Russians who happen to be living in Ukraine. They think of themselves as Ukrainians who happen to speak Russian. So with those kind of facts in mind, let's consider this piece of disinformation. So the overall myth that Russia was trying to spread at the beginning of the invasion is that the Russian government was and had been for years killing Russian speakers in Donetsk and Luhansk, basically for the supposed crime of speaking Russian. And this was one of the primary narratives that Russia used to justify its invasion of Ukraine. But it played out very differently in the ecosystems, in the information ecosystems, in different languages and geographies. So again, just please do remember that Ukraine is a strongly bilingual country. The country's President Zelensky, is a native Russian speaker. The idea that there was some kind of like mass killing program of Russian speakers is ridiculous. However, historically, there have been attempts to suppress the Ukrainian language. And this is the point where we have to note that Russia has a pattern of accusing others of what they themselves either have done or are planning to do. And this thread of disinformation is one that Russia had previewed quite a bit. And so the Ukrainian government was able to aggressively counter-message this. And in some cases, the US government pre-butted specific false stories by the Russians about this when they had the intelligence to do so. So a specific event that took place, again, fairly early in this cycle, I believe in either March or April of 2021, is the U.S. got specific intelligence that Russia had made a fake video, of these supposed atrocities, and they got out in front of the story, said, we've received intelligence that this is going to happen. You should be suspicious of a video that comes out like this from Russia. And in fact, I think it was spotted quite easily by Western media. Okay, but this still has an aftermath. But there are really the aftermath is there are really two different trajectories of how this landed. So I think most people here are probably, familiar with how this landed in the West and then in the Western information ecosystem. At least in the United States, polling says that virtually no one believes this narrative. Unfortunately, polling data from inside Russia is really hard to come by and even harder to trust. But there is, polling data that is believed to be fairly reliable, showing that a majority of Russians still support the war overall. And that indicates that likely many Russians also believe this motivating reason for the war, for the war itself. Let's think a little bit about what the impacts of this are. So the impact in the West of all of this has largely been to destroy what little credibility Russia had. However, there is a very different picture inside Russia and also in some other regions, particularly the Middle East and Francophone Africa. And what we can see from these differing impacts in differing information ecosystems is that success or failure came down to whether or not this narrative was actually contested, which sounds like a very low bar to clear, but there were information ecosystems in which there was no countering voice to the message that Russia was trying to push. So obviously in Russia, Putin has been incredibly effective at controlling what information Russians have access to. And contesting disinformation inside Russia is, frankly, difficult to impossible. However, as effective as European and North American governments were at counter messaging and pre-butting, is just wasn't even attempted globally. But Russian disinformation was global. So what can we learn from all this? I think the first and probably most important, thing I would try to stress is that allowing an information vacuum to form, as happened in the early days of the COVID pandemic, and frankly still happens in that space, that is a grave mistake. The more successful strategy here is to monitor for points of information pressure and then flood the zone with the most accurate information you can. The primary lesson here is that if people are seeking answers, it is vitally important to make sure that the first answers they find are accurate. This is something that the CDC really struggled to do for organizational reasons, among others. It's just difficult for a committee to move quickly. But unfortunately, speed is of the essence. Once an information vacuum has formed, it is a ripe zone for misinformation, and adversaries will not hesitate. But of course, this also brings up other problems. And specifically, what do you do when the facts are uncertain? The mistake when you are in an uncertain situation is to delay communication. But again, it's very understandable why people and organizations delay communicating when they don't know the facts on the ground. But the better way is that in the face of uncertainty, while you cannot communicate certainty, what you can do is communicate the range of possibilities. The lack of an accurate, certain answer is not a barrier for adversaries. They will offer an inaccurate but certain answer. Clearly communicating uncertainty is better than not communicating, and it's often the best we can do in uncertain circumstances. Okay, moving on. Lastly, and this shouldn't come as a surprise, waiting to debunk after misinformation has already spread is it is a very difficult task. We really don't know how to effectively convince people that a piece of misinformation they've already been convinced of is false. We know a lot of things that don't work. We really don't know many things that do. However, we actually do have some science that pre-bunking can be fairly effective. And the primary lesson from this is that information has a first mover advantage. Once someone has been convinced of an idea, changing their mind is extremely difficult. It's important to lead with facts and, if necessary, inoculate against disinformation that you're about to tell someone about with a truth sandwich. That's what I've been doing with you today. When I was walking you through different examples of disinformation, I started with, what the basic facts were. I told you about the disinformation, and then I gave you some more supporting information about that disinformation tactic. Getting into exactly how to deliver a truth sandwich is a little bit beyond the scope of what we have time for today, but there's actually fairly good research about this that you'll be able to find. So this might be a good time to take a little pause and maybe see if there are questions that I can answer. So Alexandra, how do you normally do this with questions?
So we typically encourage our alumni to unmute themselves and they can ask a question directly to you. If there's anyone in the audience that would like to ask
I have a question. My name is Amy. I'm calling in from the south of France. I went to NYU Film School. What I wonder all the time is how to stop the dissemination of disinformation in light of the First Amendment. I have been called a fascist for saying I think there needs to be some kind of control, some way of monitoring disinformation. But how do you do it in light of the First Amendment? That's my question.
So a lot of the way I think about this problem is not, I think it is a mistake to think about this as a content problem, because fundamentally, the problem is often not that a piece of content exists. The problem is that it is being amplified by Facebook, or by TikTok or by YouTube, right? The problem is that there are patterns that mean that certain types of content are much more likely to be amplified by content recommendation algorithms, because those algorithms are usually not built for safety. So I think it is not really, I think that the content moderation issue is, I understand why people focus on it, because like the content is the thing that's often harmful, that is in front of your face. But I think that the solution is not necessarily building systems for more aggressive content moderation. I think the system is building content recommendation that is safer and more user focused. And the other thing I would say is, the content, the First Amendment thing is, again, kind of orthogonal to the actual issue here, because platforms for social media restrict speech in many, many ways. They have, pages and pages of policies of what you can and can't post and of what they will and won't recommend. And we were talking mostly about content. Like, it's not illegal to lie to people, nor does I think just about anyone think it should be, but fraud is illegal. And a lot of what we're talking about is fairly basic consumer fraud. Platforms have policies against fraud. They just often don't enforce those policies very well. But that's why I would encourage you to think more about systems rather than content.
Thank you.
Okay, if there are no other questions on these case studies or or truth sandwiches or disinformation, maybe this would be a good time to switch over to talking a little bit about Facebook ads during the 2022 midterms and Ad Observatory. So I'm just going to quickly drop a link in the chat and then I'll share my screen again. So unfortunately, we couldn't put this in the announcement because this was only announced today. But my team at Tandon, we launched our tools for monitoring the US election this cycle today. And what I'd like to do is just show you how this tool works and some of the things you can use it for. Okay. Okay, so I think everyone can see my screen. So I should first say that we first launched this tool in 2020, and it was I think a very effective tool for monitoring a variety of elections that cycle, and the cycle we've built even more functionality into it. So there were many issues on the ballot last night. There were several primaries in several states, but something that I saw this morning that was getting a lot of attention was the race in Kansas, because in addition to its primaries, Kansas also had a ballot measure asking whether the state constitution could be amended to restrict abortion. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm just going to look at Facebook ads in Kansas. So I've picked region, I've picked Kansas, and I can see, first of all, spend over time. It's probably unsurprising that in the lead up to an election, there were some ups and downs, but in general, weekly spend has been climbing. I can see what types of ads people are running. People are running a lot of, these are donation ads. These are ads, actually, sorry, these are connect ads. These are ads where politicians are basically list building. These are donation seeking ads, and here are others. We can also see who the top spenders are in Kansas. I happen to know that Value Them Both is a PAC that was trying to encourage people to vote for this ballot measure to change the state constitution. And obviously Planned Parenthood supports abortion rights. And we can also see the spend and impression by demographic. So this is who is doing the spending. This is who is seeing the ads. So as we can see, abortion was a huge issue driving spending in Kansas. But we might want to look at the abortion topic more broadly. And we might want to better understand how people are spending money on this topic across the nation. So I can come over here, I can look at the abortion topic, and I can see a tremendous amount of money, $13 million, has been spent on this topic in just the last 90 days. So we can see some big spikes here. And you're probably familiar with the events that probably drove these spikes. And we can see when we look at this issue nationwide, that it's a slightly different picture than it is in Kansas, where there was a specific ballot measure up for a vote. Nationally, we see a lot of advertising by Planned Parenthood, and they're definitely doing some fundraising and some list building, on this abortion topic. And something that I find really interesting, when looking at this topic, is the demographic spread is pretty big, where many, many more women are seeing these ads than men. And when we look at where these ads are being shown, again, we see a really diverse picture. There's a lot of impressions going on in Texas, but there's honestly, they're being served up nationally. And so this first view is impressions per spend. This is how many people in each country are seeing these ads, but we can also look at spend by region, and we see a slightly different picture. This is just because different markets are more or less expensive. The California market is quite expensive, so it doesn't surprise me that more is being spent in California, even if they're not getting the same number of eyeballs as Texas is. So if we wanted to look, a little bit more concretely, so we have built out these topic models that are fairly complex, but you can also just do a plain old keyword search and see how spend on that particular keyword looks. Just to keep us on one topic, I'm going to search for the actual word abortion. And I see a much smaller amount of spend, but I do see a very similar pattern of, a little bump here. I think when everyone kind of knew what was coming, this much bigger bump when the Dobbs decision was released, and a similar but not identical list of advertisers. Again, we see this really big demographic split in terms of who's being shown these ads, but we see again, like a very similar view of where these ads are being seen. Something else you can do from a keyword search is I can see I can click through to Meta's own ad library, and I can see the actual underlying ads that match this search. So we can't do this for everything because Meta doesn't have the concept of topics that we have. They don't have the concept of elections that I'm going to show you next. But if you wanted to, try to understand, like, well, what are these ads? Clicking through to this ad library will give you a view of that, and so here we see, what we mean in practice. Okay, I have a few more views I can show you. So if I look at these advertisers, one thing that jumps out a little bit is focus on the family, because most of the top spenders on the abortion topic are left. They're part of the Democratic Party, they're Democratic candidates, or they're organizations that we've classed as left-leaning. Focus on the family is the top right-wing spender using the abortion keyword. So I can click on focus on the family, and that takes me to our sponsor view. So one thing I'm going to quickly note is Meta is having their own data outage right now. So for a lot of data for the last day, you'll see it plunges to zero. That's we're unfortunately bound by the limitations of our incoming data. But we can see over the last 90 days that spend has been increasing quite a bit, and we can see that for the most part they are list building. They are spending a lot of money on ads about abortion. I should say the judicial branch, right now at this moment in time, the Supreme Court is so closely tied to abortion, that's not really a surprise. And we do have a topic called donation because we do see many people running ads where not just the purpose, but everything that the ad says is about donating money. So that's not surprising either. And then when we look at spend per region, and I should mention that this is in this particular view, this is weighted by population. So that's why I think I imagine that's why we're seeing a very high spend per person in Vermont, because Vermont does not have a lot of people. That's at least a little bit interesting. And this is another view where you can click over and, if you want to understand what this dashboard is telling you, maybe you want to know what all these connect ads look like. You want to know what the spend over time looks like in practice. You can come over here, take a look, and you can see the specific ads that we're talking about. And this is very much telling a very similar story. This is more of a view of the trees, and whereas we are showing you the forest. The last thing that I wanted to show you was our election view. So I would caution you that a lot of primaries are still have either just happened or are about to happen. So not all races have clean two candidates quite yet. But if we look at a race that I think is fairly clean right now, the Georgia Senate race is pretty important. And, we can see that, Herschel Walker and Raphael Warnock have a lot of spending. Kind of surprises me that Herschel Walker has been spending so much, but I guess it's unsurprising. We see a lot of donation-seeking ads, which, by the way, is very normal for this part in an election cycle. Early in the cycle, most ads are donation-seeking. By the end of the cycle, most of them will be persuasion ads, and we can see that they're actually talking about quite different things. Herschel Walker has ads about the election, abortion, but they've got a different mix. Although it is, I think, interesting to note that Raphael Warnock and Herschel Walker both have really nationalized campaigns. I want to show you a race that I happen to know looks a little different. So I'm going to look at Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania Senate race. So here, we can see that, Dr. Oz is just not running Facebook ads. He's just not particularly present on Facebook for whatever reason. And, so here we see John Fetterman's spend over time. We can see for the most part, he's donation seeking. Again, that's really normal for this point in the cycle. And really specifically, as many Senate races are these days, John Fetterman is running a national campaign. He's running, the highest concentration of spend is still in Pennsylvania, but he is fundraising, from Democrats all across the country. And, Dr. Oz is very much not doing that. He's really spent, I think, not just the majority, but nearly all of his spend has been in Pennsylvania. So I'm not going to go through all of this, but the last thing I'll point you to, I've shown you a lot of extracted data that comes from models that we've built. And you can find information about how to use this tool and some of the methodology that we use to build those models on our methodology page. But this might be another moment to pause and see if folks have questions, whether that's a question about how we do this or maybe something else you'd like to see. Well, hearing no questions, This is, it's been a real treat to be with you. And I hope this is a tool that you can play around with. And that's all I have for today.
Thank you, Laura, so much for your, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say thank you. It's a great tool. Thank you.
Yes, and thank all of our alumni for joining us this afternoon. Concludes the lunch and lecture series, and we wish everyone a wonderful day.